You know, there's a place where girls can go and learn how to be witches, and that's actually really cool. Yeah, we're talking about that one today. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and not just books, but one book in specific, and that is A Hat Full of Sky by Terry Pratchett. It's the second book in the Tiffany Aching sub-series of Discworld. We're up in the 30s in the Greater Discworld read-along. This is book number 32, I think. I keep confusing them. It may be book 33. Anyway, my point is, we'll be talking about that one today. I hope I can actually get this video recorded because it's incredibly hot up here and I don't have air conditioning, so please bear with me. Anyway, we'll do the usual thing, which is we'll talk about the book like as a quick synopsis, and then I'll have a refreshing drink of beer while y'all go out and read the book. It's relatively short, so you can do that, and then we'll talk about themes and spoilers and structural stuff and all the good bits in this book. So, ready? Well, in that case, let me tell you about, well, liking, subscribing, commenting, and all these things. And let me say thank you to all my patrons on Patreon. You really help me out. I appreciate it a lot. And if you want to help me out just for once, there's a PayPal link down there, and there's a GoFundMe that is really helping me to get back on my feet in a lot of ways. I'll just put those links down there. Anyway, share them, tell people about them, and maybe help me out if you can. And now let's talk about the actual book, right? So, A Hat Full of Sky does follow directly after the events of The We Free Men, more or less. It's like a half a year or something in between, but it is a direct sequel. That means you should probably go and read The We Free Men before you read A Hat Full of Sky. It does follow the adventures of young Tiffany Aching, who has to go up to Lancre to learn how to be a witch with another witch that will hopefully teach her. And then, unfortunately, things happen and she has to confront herself and some other threats and figure out what being a witch actually means. It is a bit less well-structured than The We Free Man. It deals with more things at the same time, and it does actually have a quick author's afterword where Terry Pratchett does make some connections to real-world history, which kind of emphasizes the this is actually a book for younger readers thing in a way that We Free Man maybe didn't make as clear. However, it is, in my opinion, not as strong as We Free Men, but still a brilliant children's book. And if you enjoyed the first one, or your children did enjoy the first one, then yeah, go ahead and read this one. It's still really cool and does have some fantastic bits in it. Yeah, I can't say more without spoiling things, so I'll have a bit of a drink and you go and read the book, and then we'll talk about spoilers, right? All right, so glad you're back. I hope you enjoyed the book. I certainly did. So let's talk a bit about the things that are in there and how they work or don't work compared to the first one that I said, The We Free Man. Yeah, I think this one is a little weaker because structurally it is not as coherent or as straightforward as We Free Man. There are several bits and pieces that kind of fall into place if you think hard about it, but it's not as obvious. You have the whole thing with Tiffany hanging out in the mountains, figuring out how to be a witch. You have the plot with the Hiver. You have the conflict with the other girls, which is sort of like high school drama almost in a lot of ways. It just doesn't congeal as well as it did, gel as well as it did in The We Free Man. It's nevertheless still a very good book and does have some really cool bits. There's some foreshadowing, some almost dark foreshadowing compared to other books, and some heavy themes in here. So let's look at some of these questions that we deal with in this book. And let's start with helping people. Remember back in The We Free Man, there was that mention by Granny Aching that says, those who can has to do for those who can't, and someone has to speak for those who have no voice. And that is a motto that I still stand by. Pratchett does, however, elaborate, because in her work up in the mountains, Tiffany meets, well, a lot of witches and learns what witches do, which is go from house to house, do community work, caring work, their emotional labor, help people that can't help themselves, or well, maybe don't want to help themselves, and so forth. And a lot of that work, caring work, is well, it's stressful, it's heavy work, it's hard work, and you get less thanks than you might think for it. It's not always really appreciated, and you come across people that, from an outside perspective, you might think, well, they should be able to do these things on themselves. You might even think they may be stupid or lazy or all kinds of other things that we tendentially look down upon in society. And that's exactly what happens with Tiffany when she goes out with Mrs. Levels. We'll not talk about the two people in one body, one person in two bodies thing. It's a fun bit, but I don't think it adds too much here. However, yes, that feeling that maybe people should be willing and able to do more for themselves is a strong one. It's one that we find in society, and it's definitely a thought that most of us probably have had before when we help people out, and we figured like maybe they should be able to do those things themselves. And Tiffany deals with that, or tries to deal with it, which is, well, it's part of that. Because one thing that comes to this idea is like helping people out means you do it no matter what, because you can, and they can't, and you don't necessarily question why they can't, although if you figure out why they can't, you can help them to help themselves, which is the next step. It's how we should do these kind of things in communities. And that's something that Tiffany learns over time. However, there is that level of frustration in there. And this is where these things kind of tie together. The level of frustration, the level of not being taken seriously, of maybe even being wronged. There's a level of fear in there. All of that leads to us sometimes wanting to, well, go against our better nature and actually just tell people to shut up and tell people to deal with shit and just be as selfish, as greedy, as powerful as we want to be. Because, yeah, come on. If it's so clear for us, why isn't it clear to anyone else, right? So there is that urge in there. And I think we all have had that urge, and part of being human, in society, is that obviously the point where we override that with our will and our soul. That's exactly it. It's what Pratchett calls the beast when we're talking about Sam Vimes in the Night Watch books, in the City Watch books, where it is that, well, impulse to just punch and punch and punch because people are bad people, and we override that. We don't let our more instinctive side out. And it's, once again, that part that comes across in here, which, you know, kind of makes sense. In this case, Tiffany's already 11 now, but we're slowly approaching puberty here, and it's one of those things that happen to us all when we grow up. We sometimes feel no one understands us and everyone is stupid, and we should just be able to do these things. And part of puberty is, of course, that we do break the rules and think we know better than anyone else. And Pratchett does the thing that fantasy can do, and Pratchett can do so well, which is you take that part of human evolution, of general life experience, and you turn it into something magical. You make those images, you make those metaphors literal by making them magical, which brings us to the Hiver. Now, the Hiver is a very fascinating creature. I like the idea of just being, you know, will and fear, with no body, and that fear and that fright leading to the wish or the will to gain as much power as possible to defend against that fear. And I think having that kind of monster is a really cool idea. It possessing Tiffany does work well because it basically exemplifies those dreams or those thoughts that most of us will have over time from time to time. It does personify that in a magical way and allows Tiffany to not get away with, but do all of those things, like have the full-on power trip, the full-on power fantasy that we usually don't have, even if we dream of it, and then learn of the consequences, which is exactly that. Yeah, doing just whatever you want in that moment because you can does cause a lot of harm. It also causes a lot of harm to yourself, because at the end of the day, what makes us human is more than just a will to power and possibly the capacity to actually live out that will to power. And you don't have to look far to find people that don't get any consequences for their really stupid ideas and stupid actions, and how that does cause a lot of damage to everyone and probably doesn't really make them better people at the end of the day. So the Hiver episode does give us that. And the Hiver gets pushed out through Tiffany remembering who she is, being the land, in this case, the Chalkland, and remembering those parts, because, and this is Pratchett's general philosophy of, community, and community being one important part, and community being tied to a geography of hope, oftentimes with him, which means that, Tiffany remembers her nature, which is witch of the chalk, and all of that stuff, and that does add those dimensions that go beyond just fear and the wish to actually live free of fear. So there is that. Pratchett moves on from that, and I think that's the very powerful thing here, which is once Tiffany has freed herself from the Hiver for the first time, she has to face up to all the terrible things she did. And there's some pretty dark stuff in here. She kills someone, she steals, and so forth. And I really appreciate how we then see Tiffany trying to own up to these things. This is a children's book, so having the two buddies with Mrs. Level does work wonders there, because yes, you can kill someone without having actually your main character murders someone, which is pretty dark. We have the thing with old Mr. Weevil, which actually ends up in a positive way, although I do really appreciate the fact that Tiffany, as our main character, feels it's unfair that she didn't suffer any negative consequences for stealing because her friends helped out. And there's an important element there when Granny Weatherwax goes and tells her, you have friends that you don't deserve, just appreciate that. And I think that's a very valuable lesson. It's one that I, for example, I'm really struggling with when I asked for help and suddenly people came through and I'm like, wow, I don't deserve this. Like, deserve doesn't come into it, because once you talk about deserving, you're once again talking about exchange. We're once again talking about, values being weighed up one against the other. And that's not how that works. How it works, or should work, is about compassion. You see someone whom you feel with, you understand their mistake, and you help them out. And that level of compassion, I think, is what makes the book very powerful in that regard. Well, and it's, at the end of the day, what helps or solves the problem with the Hiver, because even though the Hiver may not deserve compassion for what it has done, Tiffany still gives it that compassion and helps it out, gives it a name, talks to it until it can actually, end its existence. Now, is that very much a metaphor for assisted dying? Yes, it is. And is that something that Terry Pratchett has dealt with a lot? Yes, it is. And it's interesting how Pratchett manages to actually bring that into a children's book in a child-appropriate way. I do really, really appreciate that. Also, having these one or two elements where Granny Weatherwax is slowly showing her age. She's stumbling in one situation, and in another, catching her breath and stuff like that. And now we've had that in books with Granny Weatherwax before, both in Carpe Jugulum and in a way in Lords and Ladies. It's already looked upon or mentioned, but seeing it through Tiffany's eyes, which are not, the eyes of Nanny Ogg or Margaret Garlick, who have all the past history with Granny Weatherwax, does show that impending end, because it's just a natural thing. People grow old and lose some of their agency and power, and the fear that is in that. I think it's maybe it's hindsight, because we all know how Terry Pratchett passed away at the end, but seeing these foreshadowings of Granny Weatherwax's old last years coming through, just something that really grabbed me hard. Anyway, my point is that at the end of the day, Tiffany does realize that it is about compassion. That compassion means helping people to help themselves and overlooking some of the dark things they have done, because maybe they had, not pardonable reasons, but at least reasons that we can understand if we look at it without, all of our emotions. And that brings me to the last part that I wanted to talk about, which is the debate of witchcraft, the soul and center of witchcraft, which is about helping other people whether they deserve it or not, because they need it. And we have that whole situation with Granny Weatherwax and other of the older witches versus Mrs. Earwig and the younger witches, which are clearly a, I don't want to say parody, but a portrayal of modern neo-pagan Wicca-style witchcraft. And there's a story to this here. See, in England, there were people called cunning folk, which were basically what Terry Pratchett's witches in Lancre are. People that knew a bit of magic, or people thought they knew a bit of magic, and they helped out people. Some of them were evil and dark and stuff like that, don't get me wrong, and it's a tradition that was around all the way into the early 20th century. We have reports, we have even interviews with some of these people and so forth. And some of that idea of witchcraft or magic was then transformed into the modern neo-pagan movement, which is very much about flaunting your magic, and is much more individualistic, even though it talks about covens and so forth. It talks about hierarchy. Nevertheless, you have someone running the coven. You have all these ideas which run, according to Terry Pratchett, and I'm sort of with him on this one as far as I can say, run counter to how folk magic and folk witchcraft, as much as we want to talk of it as witchcraft, which a lot of it was, once again, psychological and helping people with animals, stuff like that, was practiced all the way into the not so far past. And Pratchett is very clear where he is with that. It's not about self-aggrandizement, it's not about all of these other things, it's about helping to keep a society running, keeping a rather small society most of the time, keeping a village, keeping everyone alive, whether they have done something recently to deserve that, because it's not about deserving, it's about need. And modern witchcraft, according to Pratchett, has kind of forgotten that. So using that criticism and also, phrasing it in the terms of, the usual like Mean Girls kind of situation at in the high school thing is a clever way. It may sort of be a bit too much for a children's book, but I personally appreciated it, and I think he does handle it well, because the message at the end of the day in children's books are about learning stuff. The message there is, once again, be helpful if you can, and don't ask the question of deserving or not deserving, because that way lies, the terrible system that we're in. And try to be the change that you want to be, no matter what. And I think that's a very powerful message. Now, beyond that, there's obviously a few jokes there. There's the witch trials, which I really appreciated, the joke. The Knack McFeagles do Knack McFeagle stuff. I felt they were funny, don't get me wrong. Them having, trying to dress up as a scarecrow man is really funny, but it's not necessarily helping the story that much compared to the We Free Men. So, they're there for comic relief, and I appreciate it, but it's not that much. We have, once again, the connections to real-world England with the chalk horse, the white horse, which Pratchett deliberately acknowledges in the afterword, and I think that does just reinforce my point that I made the last time when I talked about the We Free Men, that these books are as much about Discworld as they are about Terry Pratchett's idea of what you should know about the spirit of England, or at least parts of England that may have gotten lost over the last century of industrialization. Sort of the thing that Pratchett that Tolkien kind of did in his own way, but Pratchett is doing it in a very different, specific way. And it's cool. Don't get me wrong. So, where does that leave us? Well, with an entertaining book that I think may have tried too much in one go, but was still, fun to read, and does have some really, really powerful messages about helping and, the question of why we help people. And the answer is because they need it. Anyway, I liked it. I hope you enjoyed it. I can't wait to talk about the next one, which will be Going Postal. Let's talk about that one in a week or two, and until then, like, subscribe, comment, read the book for God's sake, thanks and cheers.